Warning. In this episode, there are mentions of police violence and substance abuse. Please exercise caution for all listeners under 13.
So, do you remember back in September 2020 when there was all this news about an associate professor at George Washington University who was pretending to be an Afro-Latina from the Bronx?
Yeah, I do remember that. That professor's name is Jessica Krug, and she was a professor in history and Africana studies. She released a public letter in which she apologized for being, quote, a cultural leech and a, quote, coward for lying about her race and ethnicity. But in truth, she is a white Jewish woman from suburban Kansas.
So what's really interesting here is that Krug has built her career as an academic studying African and Caribbean cultures. And she's claimed to be an activist fighting against gentrification and police brutality in New York City.
It's all part of cop watching and all part of the culture. And I realize now that I'm talking about this a little bit institutionally, how did I get into this? I had no choice, really, right? So growing up, there's no escape from police violence. Literally, I was trying to think about this earlier this week. Some of my earliest memories in life are of police brutality, right? Remember one summer when I was about 5, walking from the park with my brother, who was about 12 at the time, right, and having the police throw him down on the ground, right? Just a 12-year-old boy walking his sister home from the park. So that's been my whole life. When I was a little bit older, but not too much, they shot Amadou Diallo around the corner from my home, right? For those of you who weren't in New York City at the time or might not remember, it was a man who was shot 41 times by undercovers, right? They later found that the first bullet killed him, right? Entered his chest, shredded his aorta. There are bullet holes in the bottom of his feet. Right? Is there any level of this violence that's acceptable? No, but there's a particular kind of choreography to the ways in which we're slaughtered, right?
In that clip, Krug was facilitating a workshop on cop watching, a tactic to combat police brutality at the Studio Museum in Harlem, where she fabricates a childhood story of growing up in the Bronx. She even says, those of you who were not in New York City. Was Krug even in New York City?
She was not. Not only is Krug's story grounded in stereotypes, the way she carries herself and performs this persona is also stereotypical and harmful. In the workshop, she is wearing a short, tight black skirt with a black tube top and a cheetah print jacket. And I want to point these things out, not because I want to police what women wear, but when you are trying to perform what you perceive Blackness or Latinidad to be, it is extremely harmful to fall on stereotypes that hypersexualize Black women and Latinas.
You know, that's such a great point, Rosemary. As a Black, curvy woman, I am constantly having to overthink the clothes that I wear and how I will be perceived, and if people will look past my clothing and see my intelligence and understand the content of what I'm attempting to say. Code switching can be such a huge part of professionalism for women of color, for people of color in general. And so when we think about code switching, it's not just about the way that we dress, our behaviors, but it also can be about our speech. So let's hear this clip where Krug is displaying stereotypes around the way that she feels people of color speak.
I also want to call out all these white New Yorkers who waited 4 hours with us to be able to speak and then did not yield their time to Black and brown indigenous New Yorkers who thought that their sense of, I thought cops was here to protect us, but I guess they're not. Boy, you think that this sort of like shock and empathy thing is the move. Okay, so a couple of things. You was talking about moving against the gang database. What's up with that? Because last I checked, that's still operating. Last I checked, that's still up. You talk about us to show up, been shown up in all these neighborhood council meetings trying to fight gentrification. Ain't nothing changed. And then real quick, I want to talk about some of my experiences in the Bronx on Thursday. So y'all heard from a few people who were there, and thank you. Much power to all my siblings who were standing up, my Black and brown siblings who were standing.
I wish y'all could see our faces, right? Because we're all like, absolutely not. As a Dominican New Yorker, I just want to say her accent is just no. But I think it's really interesting because I know for myself, like when I get heated or I get like really frustrated, like my accent comes out even more, or like I got really excited or something like that. But to hear her like speak with this tone in her voice and this accent and like trying to call out the white gentrifiers and calling herself part of this like Black and brown family is just absolutely, like, I want to use the word ridiculous.
Look, I change my voice all the time. You may have noticed it from podcast episodes. Like, it's inconsistent. However, that didn't even sound like the first person, right? Like, those seem like two distinctly different identities that are presenting two different people in that space. And so it was really difficult for me to digest because not only did she put on an accent, but then she changed her cadence. She changed her grammar. So much was different from the first clip to the second clip. Hello, my name is Courtney Jones-Carney.
And I'm Rosemary Ferreira. And welcome to the Table Podcast, where we unpack questions regarding race, ethnicity, culture, norms, and current events.
Unfortunately, Jessica Krug isn't the only white American woman to have been recently exposed for posing as Black or Latinx women. On January 7th, I received a text message from Rosemary. It said,
"And another one." Courtney responded,
"What in the world? This is an entire mess." And her sorry, not sorry response shows that she has learned zero lessons.
PrisonReports.org had reported that Natasha Bannon, a human rights lawyer from Georgia, claimed to be Puerto Rican and Colombian. But it's not just her either. Kelly Keene Sharp, a former professor of African American Studies at Furman University, who identified as Chicana, but did not have any ancestral ties to Mexico. And of course, there's Rachel Dolezal.
I mean, there weren't, on the application, there weren't boxes.
If there were a box. If it said white, Hispanic, Black, Asian, or other, what would you have picked?
I think when it comes to filling out forms, right, the form in particular usually defines things. So, for example, on one of the forms that I filled out, which was called into question this summer, it said white, in parentheses, having European ancestry, Black, in parentheses, human populations originating in the continent of Africa, and, Native American, it defined that. And it's like, okay, I've been a professor of African history, Black studies.
Yeah, but which one you checked, though?
So it's like, when it came, I checked white and Black because we all have human origins in the continent of Africa. I mean, that's true, right? The human populations originating in Africa is everybody.
While human population did originate out of Africa, Dolezal is a white woman who identifies as a transracial Black woman. Yes, you heard that, transracial. We're going to have to unpack that a little bit later. She was the former president of the NAACP chapter in Spokane, Washington. In 2015, her white parents reported that she is not a Black woman.
After texting each other article after article with news about white American women posing as Black women and Latinas, we wanted to make sense of this consistent pattern that we were seeing. Why are white American women pretending to be Black and Latina women? And why are they mostly in the field of academia and within social justice movements?
To address these questions, we spoke with Dr. Kyla Liggett-Creel, an assistant clinical professor at the School of Social Work at the University of Maryland, Baltimore, who identifies as a white woman raised in a multicultural household and community.
My name is Dr. Kyla Liggett-Creel. I'm an assistant clinical professor at the School of Social Work at the University of Maryland, Baltimore. A little bit about my background. I guess my family is a very interesting family. My mom was born in Argentina and grew up in Puerto Rico, but her parents are from Tennessee. White folks that lived in Tennessee, and then they went to Argentina and worked for about 5 years, and then spent 15 years working in Puerto Rico. So when my mom was born, her first language was Spanish. And because she was born in Argentina during the Perón era, they said that she had to have a name that was Latinx. So her legal name is Margarita Ana. But her parents were like, we're going to call you Peggy Ann. So, even like her birth certificate and what she was called was sort of this dichotomy. My dad, on the other hand, was born and raised in Indiana, white guy from Indiana. They got married. But my dad was a humanitarian worker in Vietnam during the war. And after serving in Vietnam for 4 years, he decided he wanted to make that his life's work, is working in Southeast Asia. So he was in and out of Vietnam and Cambodia every year for 18 years, at 6 weeks at a time. And then when I was 18, he moved to Cambodia. And so he's lived in Cambodia for 25 years. I think I just gave away my age, but that's okay. If you can do the math. So, here's this white guy living in Cambodia who speaks Khmer every day. And so he is very much involved in the Khmer community. My mom, who is a white woman, born in Argentina, raised in Puerto Rico, first language is Spanish, and she lives here in Maryland. And then when my parents got married, they were living in Vietnam and decided to adopt a daughter. And my sister she is Afro-Amerasian. So her biological father was African-American and her biological mother is Vietnamese. So when they moved here to the States, this was in 1975, by all appearances, she looks African-American. Nobody looks at her and says, oh, you look like you're Vietnamese. She looks African-American. So in 1975, there was, it was a transracial adoption with two white parents and an African-American daughter. And then they had me. And so they wanted to make sure that my sister was raised in a community where she saw people and had role models that looked like her. And so they decided to move into Shaw, which is in Washington, D.C. We're down the street from Howard University. This was in the late 70s, early 80s, which, during the crack epidemic, and Shaw was severely impacted. And Shaw was also impacted by the uprising when Martin Luther King was murdered. And so we had, buildings that were burnt out, that had never been fixed. We had schools that, were underfunded, severely underfunded. And we had, crack vials in what I thought was my backyard. And then later on was like, oh, that's an alley. I thought it was a backyard. Okay. And, prostitutes that were on the corner. And I was raised in a Black Baptist church, 6,000 members, founded by 17 runaway enslaved people. And so I grew up in a church where, Martin Luther King had preached, where Jesse Jackson had been regularly there, where, it was a center of the civil rights movement in DC. So I grew up, being the only white child in an all Black church, being an usher, on the usher board and an alto in the choir. And so my upbringing was very influenced by the African-American community, because that was my church, that was my community, and those were my schools. And so when I went to college, I decided I wanted to major in family sciences, but I focused on the African-American family because I knew that I wanted to go back and either work in DC or work in a city that was similar to DC. And then I went to Smith College, and I chose that because it's an anti-racist institution. So I wanted to make sure that my social work education would be with anti-racism lens. And then I ended up in Baltimore, and I've been here ever since. And I've worked as a therapist, and now work with grassroots organizations addressing trauma and racism in Baltimore. So that's a little bit about me and sort of my background.
Thanks for joining us today, Kyla. Can I call you Kyla?
Yes, of course, please.
So, like, you talked about your family growing up and living in different countries, living in and among different cultures, honoring those cultures, but not like consuming those cultures or putting those cultures on in a way that would not be genuine and show appreciation and understanding for those cultures. However, we were kind of seeing this phenomenon where white women are posing as Black or Latinx women and recreating their entire family history. And so it's, what are your reactions to those this new phenomenon that we're seeing, where white women are adopting these personas that really become caricatures of what it is to be Black or what it is to be Latinx, what it is to be a person of color?
Yeah, it's interesting when I've seen it happening and I've watched the stories about it, it brought up a lot of questions for me because I, at first really had to think like, why are they doing that? Like, what are they trying to get out of it? What's their purpose in it? And I've come to a couple of different thoughts. I don't know if any of them are right, but just some thoughts. I think that they may be in places where they don't understand why it's okay for them not to be in all spaces. And I think that comes with the privilege of being a white woman, right? That they're sort of like, I belong everywhere. And so if you're doing social justice work and somebody says, oh, you can do this, but right now we need to have a Black space or we need to have a Latinx space. So we need you not to be here. That their privilege gets riled, like, well, no, I should be anywhere I want to be. And they're not exploring that and saying, no, that's actually not what there should be. And so you're actually using your privilege to say, well, then I'll just morph myself into this other, expression or this other being because I should be able to go wherever I want because I'm not used to barriers, right? So I think that that's one interpretation. I think that when if we're looking for a theoretical framework to say like, why, I look at Beverly Daniel Tatum's work when she's talking about racial identity development. And I just wonder if some of these women are like in that immersion phase where they're uncomfortable with their whiteness. And they're not doing the work of figuring out how can you be a white ally, right? Like really a white ally. So they become this sort of denial of like, oh, I want to do this other work and I believe in it, but I'm uncomfortable with my whiteness and I don't want to be the white person in the room doing this work, where sometimes you do have to say, oh, sit down now. Okay. Stand up now. Okay. And be able to move like that. And so then they kind of are like, well, I'm uncomfortable with it. I don't like these barriers. So I'm going to morph into this other presentation. What gets me is that they don't get that that's a problem. like, even if you think like, well, maybe let me see, that they don't stop and go, but I don't have the same experiences as the people in this room. I don't live this existence, right? I mean, I can walk anywhere I go. I am treated as a white woman. And so the other people in this space do not have that privilege. And even if you want to tan and perm your hair and all that craziness, the reality is you can undo it. People of color cannot undo that and be like, today I'd like to be white. And then tomorrow I'll go back. Like, that's not a thing. So those were two thoughts that I had. And again, I don't know if it's right, but sort of, again, I still wonder, like, but they still don't get that it's wrong. That's the core that come back to, like, but even if that's what they do, they don't get that there's a problem with it.
Yeah, your point of Dr. Tatum's racial identity development and like the feeling of being uncomfortable with whiteness reminded me of like Yeah, like there's this pattern as well. Not only are they white women posing as Black and Latinx women, these women are also in academia, in like social justice spaces. One of them was the former president of the Lawyers Guild, which focuses on social justice in the field of law. And so I feel like there's also this thread of feeling uncomfortable with their whiteness because they're in these spaces where, like what you're saying, like people of color have developed because these are safe spaces for them, living in the hostility of what is white supremacy. But I wanted just to hear if there's additional thoughts on connecting these white women to academia and to these social justice spaces.
I mean, it is interesting that that's one of the places that you see it pop up the most. That, and I think it's the maybe the not understanding of how, as a white person, you can do social justice work and still be white and be okay. And I think it's part of it is the cultural humility piece. Like, sit down. It's not your time to talk. Sit down. Right. And being okay with that. And even being okay with, like, I've been in spaces where I've looked around and said, well, wait a minute, we don't have a member of the community here. So we need to create a space for a member of the community. And when I said that, somebody said, well, this is already a big group. And so if we start opening up, it gets bigger. So I had to say, that's okay. I will give up my seat. And that way, it can be the same size, but you have a member of the community sitting at the table, right? So, but if you are not able to really be humble enough to be able to be like, yeah, I'll give this up, right? Because it's not about me. If you're not willing to say, well, yeah, maybe I'm not going to be a tenured professor because I'm not going to publish on the backs of people of color because that does well for me, then they may fall into that trap of like, well, I don't want to give up my seat, but I do want to fight for social justice. So maybe if I say, well, I actually represent that community, then you get to keep a seat at the table. And I just wonder if that's part of it, that there's also like how do you move your profession along? Again, I don't understand it because to me, it's so like, but don't you see that's wrong? Like that's counter to what you're supposed to be working towards. So I don't get why they don't move that place. I also think that they don't recognize that there is power in being a white person doing this work, in that there are places that I can get to say things and do things that people of color cannot. And so the difference is that I use that power to break down barriers, or I use that power to open up doors, and then I get out of the way. Like, oh, okay, this is moved. Let me get out of the way and get other people in there. And they don't seem to understand that we should be using that to break down barriers because we can do it in a different way than people of color can. So I think it's interesting that they don't use that privilege in a more productive way.
So thinking about this connection to academia, could it somewhat be related to the fact that that's a place where you study, where you possess expertise? So you're studying and learning a culture, and then you deem yourself an expert in that culture. So there might be Black studies or Latinx studies or Latin American studies, right? And so then you're in academia, you're learning about the development of individuals, foundational moments for, monolithic sort of large groups of people, and then you begin to adopt them as your own. And so to me, it seems like academia could be the perfect place to develop this sort of identity because you are studying and because you received a degree. And somehow in your head, that means that you're now an expert on what it is to be Black or what it is to be Latinx. And then you try that on. But what I think is really interesting about many of these women is the comments of how their stories were so stereotypical, right? Like it was very much so this one person
person, I think Krug said that she was a child of the ghetto or something along those lines, and talked about having to leave an event because her parents had just OD'd. And the stories that she told were the stories that reinforce very harmful stereotypes about groups of people, because there's a lack of understanding about the diversity, perhaps within a particular racial or ethnic group. And so you're just trying on these stereotypes and trying to figure out what fits, because that's what you studied and that's what you learned. And that's the lens that perhaps was used throughout your education. It was more so about deficit than anything else.
Yeah, I think that I think that there is a pull sometimes to tell like the for lack of a better term, the war stories, right? Like, I came from this background and I fought my way up, and all of this other stuff. And but it's interesting, because even if you go with the idea of, okay, they've learned, and so they've, studied, and so now they consider themselves experts. But if you're truly an expert, you know that learning is forever, and that you never arrive at a destination of knowing everything. And that, especially in this field, as a white person, I can study everything, I can read everything, I can go to everything, I can do all that. I'm never going to know what it's like to be a person of color walking down the street. Never. I'm never going to know that. Right. And so, but I do think that, you have to be able to admit that. And I think, honestly, I think there's some professors who don't like to admit that they don't know everything. I mean, I'm not throwing shade at anybody in particular, but I think that, there is this like, well, I'm the expert, so I'm here to answer all of your questions. Right. I still just find it interesting that, like, okay, so even if you know all about African-American history or Latinx history, and cultural norms and rituals and all of that there's some point that you cross over and say, yeah, this is okay for me to pretend that I am this person. Like that seems like there's something else going on there, like something else is happening that would make you even think that that's okay, especially in the field of social justice, because I mean, we know that is not okay. So, so the only thing I can think of that is some way it's like street cred, right? Like, oh, let me make up these stories to show that I've gone through the storm, and that way I can have these conversations. But again, to Courtney's point, it's so harmful, because especially when you're just using stereotypes like, oh, this is my experience. And it's like, well, first of all, it's not your experience. But second of all, you're just grabbing these stereotypes and applying it so that people are like, oh, yeah, that's the reality. Because look, there's a perfect example.
I think it's such a great point. I know, as someone who does diversity, equity, and inclusion work, I'm a Black woman who grew up in Philadelphia in a middle-class Black neighborhood, attending a private school and playing tennis. And so I'm someone who has had a great deal of privilege and access. And I've had white people tell me I can't do this work because I don't know what it is to be Black. And I'm like, wait a minute. No, I walk through the world Black every single day. But because I've had privilege doesn't mean that I'm not Black. And that doesn't mean that there wasn't a time when I drove a bougie car and got pulled over by the police many times because it was not believed that that bougie car belonged to me. Right. And so I do know what it means to be Black, but being Black doesn't necessarily mean that I have so many war stories about not having access, right? But I still have these experiences because that Black experience is not monolithic at all. And so I think that brings up this great point of there's this idea of what it means, right? And in order to do this work, you have to have the struggle story because that's going to inform the work. So can we back up for a second and discuss what is this phenomenon called? Sometimes on social media, people will talk about folks are blackfishing. So they're making adjustments to their features. We may have seen some videos. Specifically, it makes me think of these videos that involve Asian men who are doing this elaborate hairstyle that involves providing additional texture to their hair, right? Which would make their hair appear to be, I'm going to put this in quotes, but like African American hair, Black hair, right? That's the goal. Or, we'll see folks like the Kardashians who are tanning, who are augmenting their bodies. And so that might be referred to as Blackfishing. I don't know if there's an equivalent for folks who are, attempting to look as though they are Latina. I don't know if there's an equivalent term. We've heard the term transracial come up, like, can someone, transition from one race to another? But does that apply to everyone? Is there only like a one-way transition? Do you have to be, white presenting in order to transition into a different race? And if you are visibly a person of color, are you able to be transracial? But none of those terms really seem to fit the phenomenon. So I don't know. What are your thoughts? Anyone want to come up with a term that they think describes what's happening, or at least say what they think it's not?
Well, I definitely do not have a term. But I think something that I did also want to bring up, I identify as Dominican, I identify as Latina, even though I'm also like trying to move away from, the problems within Latinidad. But what a lot of Black folks from Latin America were pointing out was that, these women were able to adapt Latinx identities because within the Latinx community, light-skinned white Latinx are usually the ones who hold power and who do get access and who do get, promoted to the president of the Lawyers Guild or, get the associate professor tenured position. And so I did just want to bring that nuance too within the Latinx identity, because while it is an ethnic group, even though, again, it's very complex, within that identity, there are different racial groups. And what Black folks are saying from Latin America is that, these white women are getting to do that because of how whiteness is censored within Latinx identity in the first place, right? So yeah, that's definitely still do not have a name for it. But I just find it interesting that Latinx identity is within all of these examples, or, well, not Rachel Dolezal, but within these recent examples. And I think the ambiguity of what Latinx means is a way that they're able to kind of sneak in.
Yeah, I don't, it's interesting because, what Rosemary, it's interesting how colorism is also a part of this conversation, right? That there is this sort of like, oh, the lighter, the better. And so, all of these women would be considered very, very, very light skinned, because they're actually white. So in some ways they were sort of like, oh, yes, I'm going to morph over, or I'm going to pass is this other race, but they're still holding a lot of power because of their light skin, because of their, their hair being straighter, things like this. So even within the community, they were holding privilege because of their light eyes, light skin, straightened hair, that kind of thing. And, it's interesting because, of course, the term of passing, at least in the African-American community, was actually to pass so that you could gain privilege and try to avoid some of the oppression and discrimination. So if you could pass, then you would do that to try to survive in this racist society. So it's interesting to hear that white women are now like trying to pass in the other direction, where it's like you're passing to try to give up certain privilege, but you don't give it up, because in the end, you can always go back. You can literally at the end of the day be like, now I'm white. Right? Like, so you're not really giving up any privilege. So I don't think there is a term. I also think gender, we have to look at why is it women who are doing this? And what is it? Is it that they're not able to get the power that the men do? And so they're not going to go that way. And So then they're going to go in this other direction and be able to hold this, what they see as power, but not understanding how damaging they are being by trying to do it that way, and what they're taking away from people who are actually living the lives that they're pretending to live.
Yeah, so I guess just thinking about like, what does it look like to do that work, and what does it look like to appreciate culture without appropriating culture, which, again, is not the phenomenon that we're seeing. It's not just as simple as appropriation. What many of these women have done is much deeper than appropriation, but we still don't have a term for it. Maybe we should, the three of us, get together and coin something, because I doubt that we've seen the last of folks being exposed for whatever this phenomenon is. But yeah, how do you go about like respectfully connecting and building relationships, particularly with cultures and communities that are different from your own?
So I think that's a great question. I mean, what I've tried to do is learn as much as possible, listen as much as possible. I regularly, say like, hey, I'm a white woman entering this space. And so, if there are times that you need me to exit, then let me know. Or if there's times that you need me to step in, and being upfront with that, to the point where some people are like, yeah, we're okay that this is a multiracial space. Like, that's okay. And I'm like, yeah, I'm okay with that too. But you also, we need to recognize that in this place, I am a guest, and this is not my space. This is your space. And so, recognizing that, and even creating it. When I created the Healing Youth Alliance, which is for African-American youth, and they have African-American social work mentors, like I stayed completely out of the space and behind the scenes to do the work, until they were like, no, we want you here. And then it was like, oh, okay, I'll come in. So I think, recognizing the history and the culture and giving honor to that, and then also being mindful that it's not mine. It's something I can appreciate and honor, but I didn't do the work. My ancestors didn't do the work. And if anything, my ancestors were harmful to the community that I respect and honor. And I recognize that. I totally get it. And I don't deny it, because why would I? And so, yeah, I think just holding that line, and just being clear. So when somebody is like, well, I said that in a meeting I was with 3 African-American men, and I said, I recognize that this is a movement for Black men, and I am obviously not a Black man. I am a white woman. So, let me know when you want me in or out or whatever. And one of the guys was like, I really thought you were Black. Like looking at you, hearing you, I thought you were Black. And I was like, nope, I'm white. So like just owning it and holding it and being okay with it makes such a big difference, because I've never had anybody been like, well, no, we don't like the fact that you're here. Okay. I don't have an issue with that. Like if they're just like, well, this is a Black only space. All right, cool. I'm out. And that's fine. I think that there have been times where there is an interpretation of a white woman doing this work that it's like, well, you're trying to take advantage of somehow or benefit from. And so I've had to be very clear. And that's why I have certain policies that I hold for myself to try to avoid that. But I also say, I mean, my whole job is working in a Black community with Black organizations. I have a job because that's what I do. I don't work in white communities. I don't get paid because I work in white communities. So in that way, yes, I have a job because I work in Black communities. And so you have to have those conversations sometimes. But yeah, I think I try to be very clear and very upfront about my race and recognize when I should be in spaces and when I shouldn't be. And then honoring and, like the mural behind me where I talk about, oh, here are the women in this mural and this is why I show it, is to honor the work that the members of the community do. That is not the work that I have done. But it's, every day you have to do it to make sure that you're honoring the communities that you're working in.
Yeah, I definitely appreciate that. And I agree that, because I worked at a organization that primarily served Latinx youth. And there's we had an event once talking about cultural appropriation with staff, and staff were primarily Latinx, but we also noticed that for folks who are in positions of power at this organization, they tend to be white women. And those white women were asking, essentially having that kind of, I don't necessarily say identity crisis, but definitely being like, well, how can I appreciate, Latinx culture? And I think that, like, for me, my response is essentially like what you're saying, like the culture that we have is a result of, or at least I'm going to speak from Dominican culture, a result of, colonialism. And I feel like when white American women adopt or appropriate these cultures, I feel disrespectful, disrespected, and I feel like we can't have anything for ourselves, essentially, right? Like, I feel like, white women can kind of like throw on the like sexy Latina, throw on the spicy Latina, throw on the, let me dance bachata and like, speak Spanish and all of that. And then they get to take it off and still be seen as the, pure, angelic white women, right, in society, not only in US society, but also in Latinx or Latin American cultures as well. And so, yeah, it's kind of, I just feel like, can we at least have this? You know what I'm saying? Like, can we have this for ourselves? So yeah, I definitely agree with the points that you were making.
And if I can just add to Rosemary's point, because when you said that, I was like, yep. And that's why there's distrust of white women, is because when it hits the fan, right, then all of a sudden, all of that, oh, my name is this, and this is my identity, and all of that goes out the window. Like, whoa, wait a minute, I'm a white woman, so I shouldn't have to deal with, so if you're sort of throwing on this, like, I live as a Black woman, and then you get pulled over by the cop, are you saying to that police officer, hi, police officer, I want to make sure you understand I'm a Black woman. I'd like to be treated as such. I bet you anything they're not. I bet you they're not. And I've seen situations where somebody who's white is like, oh, I hang out with all Black people and I'm really part of that community. Yeah, but when those police pulled y'all over, 3 Black men were handcuffed and sitting on the curb, and you're standing around walking around. I didn't see you saying, excuse me, could you handcuff me too and throw me down to the ground? Because I'm part of the community. And that's where they get dangerous. because white people get in those situations and they're like, oh, I'm all for the cause, I'm all for the community. And then when something happens, suddenly they're not asking, I'm sorry, could I be treated as a person of color? They're holding on to their privilege. Like, well, hold on, let me call daddy real quick and make sure that the lawyer's here. They're not saying, well, no, I'm not going to use that privilege. They use it fast. And that's why there's so much mistrust, because the privilege is in that bag, right? Like, oh, I'm going to live this life when it's like exciting and like, oh, I can wear this with a badge of honor. But then when it comes down to it, that privilege comes out real fast. And there's not a like, oh, let me give up that privilege in that moment. And it puts other people at risk. It puts people of color at risk, because all of a sudden you're looking like, did you just sell us out? And so it makes the work so much harder, because I do see that as a pattern that happens.
So, what do we call this phenomenon? Cultural leeching, blackfishing, cultural fraud, or maybe it's an extreme form of racial capitalism, which describes the systematic way that white people and historically white institutions extract social and economic value from people of color. While we are not exactly sure what to call this, we would like to acknowledge that the term transracial comes up a few times in this podcast, and it is used to describe different things. In one instance, it is used to describe the adoption of a child who is not the same race as their adoptive parents. But also, Dolezal identifies as transracial and suggests that she transitioned from being white to being Black. We would like to acknowledge that the term transracial and the connection that Dolezal makes between transracial and transgender is offensive and damaging to the transgender rights movement. As we try to figure out the right term to use to describe this phenomenon, we hope that we can agree that transracial isn't it. If you have suggestions for the naming of white women posing as Black and Latinx women, please email us at ile@maryland.edu.
The Table is a production of the Intercultural Center and the Division of Student Affairs at the University of Maryland, Baltimore. It's hosted and produced by Courtney Jones-Carney and Rosemary Ferreira. This episode was also written by Rosemary. The show's executive producer and editor is me, Angela Jackson, Senior Marketing Specialist in the Division of Student Affairs. A big thank you to our guest, Dr. Kyla Liggett-Creel, for coming to our table and joining the discussion. For more information about the Intercultural Center, including events where students can learn more about race, ethnicity, culture, norms, and current events, visit umaryland.edu/ILE. Thanks for listening. See you next time.